Right, so let me just get started. Let me go and start. No, that is not how I wanted to start. I was trying to start with this page here. Yes, so welcome again, new and returning guests and students to Epidemics of Injustice. This semester's theme is co-disruptor and co-conspirators. So as we have asked before, please introduce yourself in the chat with your names and pronouns if you'd like. Complete the check-in form, or you can scan the code that has been put in the chat already, and it will be put in a little bit throughout the session as well. During the presentation, please put any questions or comments you have in the chat, and then there will be time for some questions at the end. So here is a look at how to do the Zoom controls. If you would like to look at this more in depth, it is also in the week 1 presentation as well. That is available on Blackboard for students and the Google Classroom for community members. So I am the course instructor, Ms. Washika Torres, MYST. And then we have Nandini and Katie, who are the TAs. So about the course, this is an annual free course. One moment, something's in the way. Annual course free and open to the public, and it prepares public health leaders and community members with the tools to bring about social change and address structural determinants of health. All course meetings take place virtually, and this course is open to students and the public from 5:30 to 6:30 CST. And then students taking the course for credit, they will stay from 6:30 to 7:30 for a closed discussion. Epidemics of Injustice is also sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice at the UIC School of Public Health. And we would also like to thank Radical Public Health for the creation, support, and promotion of the program. And RPH is actually celebrating its 11th year. And for more information about RPH, we have the Facebook page here. And again, these are also available in on the week 1, like I said, the Google Class site and the Blackboard site as well. So there's content warning. Today's lecture and many of the lectures do contain materials that might be difficult to discuss. Please step away if you need to take care of yourself during the presentation. You are not required to have your cameras on. Please remember that. So self-care is very important. And so we'd also like to do a land acknowledgement, which we do weekly. So the Collaboratory for Health Justice acknowledges that the University of Illinois Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the 3 fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering these names, the Potawatomi, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821. After receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonialization and state violence and support Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. So here are the community guidelines again. It was referenced earlier, but I do want to say it again. Please show up on time, come prepared, and however you prepare yourself. Let everyone participate, listen with an open mind, have mutual respect and appreciation for one another, and please respect the privacy and personal information shared during class. And that's for community members and for students. So this week's theme is critical race theory, and we have Dr. Stovall, and I will read his bio. So David Stovall, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Black Studies and in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, so known as UIC. His scholarship investigates 3 areas. 1, critical race theory. 2, the relationship between housing and education. And 3, the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action He works with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale/Little Village School for Social Justice, also known as SOJO, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, teachers, his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at USC, he also served as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice from 2005 to 2018. So yes, we would like to welcome, let me just exit this out, stop the share. So we would like to welcome Dr. David Stovall. And if you'd like to applaud, you can, there's reaction applause in the comments. So I will turn my camera and my mic on mute and turn the floor over to him. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Washika, and thanks again to Nandini and folks who contacted me, and Katie for keeping in contact with me over the last little bit to make sure I could be here this evening with you all. Again, I'm Dave Stovall, been here at UIC. This is my 23rd year here at UIC, and you know, they ain't fired me yet, so you know, I'm here. That doesn't mean that won't happen, but you know, there's always the realness. One of the things that I want to say to you all is just really thanking you all for surviving the 3 pandemics of white supremacy, capitalism, and COVID-19. And we only talk about one pandemic, and you know, I know physicians talk about the triple-demics with the respiratory illnesses or what have you, but remember, pandemic only means trouble across region or nation. So I understand that the 3 pandemics are white supremacy, capitalism, and COVID-19, as the 3 of them are troubles across region or nation. So in that, what I want to do today is kind of position critical race theory, and I'm not going to get into what critical race theory is not, but I'm going to get into what critical race theory is, because I think there's been too many detractions and people trying to defend and saying what it's not. But I think one of the ways that we should be engaging in this is saying what it actually is and how it comes into being, and then what is it actually saying. So now when we have these public debates, that we're clear about what it means, right? And one of the things that's important around critical race theory is an understanding of the term I'm using, white supremacy, right? And white supremacy is of central importance because it is a totalizing power, like capitalism, that governs our ways of doing, thinking, and being, right? So now when we think about how capitalism controls our lives, everybody from the price of eggs to the price of gas, right? We now have to think about the ways in which white supremacy permeates our understanding. And then how do we either capitulate to it or reject it? And then I want to bring it in relationship to public health. And as a working definition, I always tell folks, we should think about white supremacy as the assumed views and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual Christian males as normal, right, and good. And everything else has been othered. Everything else has been made strange. Everything else has been rationalized for exploitation, or in the most extreme sense, disposal. So when we can actually come to grips with that framing, I think it's important for us to now understand that critical race theory is saying we can have no conversation of life in the United States without a foundation of understanding enslavement, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. And people think about that as being so divisive, because in the United States, we are too caught up in myth and really refuse to connect to reality, right? And when we look at the historical record and when we see all the blowups in school districts and everybody is clamoring and complaining about critical race theory, my thing is really thinking about what are we actually saying? And we can't have that understanding without really understanding enslavement, genocide, wrongful land appropriation in the form of settler colonialism, right? So now, if we understand that to be true, how have people resisted, right? And now, what do we learn from that resistance, right? So now if people are resisting white supremacy, if people are resisting enslavement, if people are resisting genocide, if people are resisting wrongful land appropriation, now how do we use those lessons and put it into, as the folks in radical health often state, how do we put this into a praxis, right? An action and reflection in the world in order to change it. So critical race theory originates from legal theory. And it comes by way of a person named Derek Bell, who wrote a book in the 70s called Race, Racism, and American Law. And that's, for us as critical race theorists, this is kind of known as the foundational text. So as people were reading Race, Racism, and American Law, they were also kind of grappling with, okay, well, what does this mean in terms of the legal system, right? And critical race theory, remember, was developed as a critique of something called critical legal studies. And critical legal studies also came out of legal scholarship. The argument of critical legal studies was that the US criminal legal system is a system that is broadly based on class. So depending on how much wealth, access, and influence you have, it will determine the decisions that are made on your body in person in court. And Derek Bell read critical legal studies and said that analysis is short. There's parts of it that are true, but it's missing some things. So in the United States, we don't have a criminal legal system that is just solely based on class. We have a criminal legal system in the United States that is based on race, class, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation, disability, right? So now when you think about those things, depending on where you are in those understandings, the criminal legal system will have a way to marginalize you. And again, not controversial, but keyed into the historical record, right? These are things like the 13th Amendment, which eliminates slavery except for punishment for a crime, or the preamble of the Constitution that talks about the 3/5 clause, or the 14th Amendment that's supposed to be due process, which is tragically denied all the time, or the 15th Amendment is talking about the right to vote. So now that's always denied or contested depending on who the particular aggrieved party is. So now if we think about it in this way, the question becomes, if we understand white supremacy to operate in this way, then why does a discussion of this become a threat? And I always like to use the quote from a psychologist by the name of Neely Fuller. And I appreciate what Neely Fuller always says. He says, if you do not understand white supremacy, everything else will confuse you. And I think in the United States, we have really kind of grappled and still battle and deny that confusion. So critical race theory says, how do we now start to think about no longer being confused, but developing clarity on actually what is happening? So Derek Bell's students actually were getting into his books, Race, Racism, and American Law, Faces at the Bottom of a Well. And they were into his piece, and they actually had a conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. And the people who came out of that conference who were talking about the ways in which to understand this critique of critical legal studies, and hence the name critical race theory, right? So critical race theory is not some conspiratorial thing. Critical race theory is an analysis of life in the United States in relationship to the criminal legal system that is now morphed into our understandings of schools, space, and public health, right? So now we talk about, and you often hear people talk about an intersectional analysis, and that comes by way of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was part of that conference. And Kimberly Crenshaw says that we should think about our understandings not as monolithic beings, right? So it's not just, we do not just occupy one form of identity or one form of identification, but we have all of these forms of identity and identification along the lines of race, class, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation, religious group, and the like. And the criminal legal system, and this was Kimberly Crenshaw's critique, at one time, the criminal legal system said in any case of discrimination, you had to pick one. And Crenshaw's critique said, well, in our lives, we're never living these singular spaces. So why does the criminal legal system compel us to just choose one? So now we start to think about this. It allows for us to understand the critique, but it also allows us to understand what it is that we're in. So I was introduced to critical race theory by way of education by a guy named Lawrence Parker, who was talking about, look, if we look at schooling in the United States, we now have to ask a question as to why, in some instances, depending on who you are and where you live, the schooling system will be shaped to further marginalize you in opposed to educating you, right? And it's a basic question that we always have to grapple with, and I always ask my students, when did you disconnect with school, right? And for lack of a better term, when did you say to yourself, you're in a classroom and you say, man, this is bullshit, this is not working. And because it's not working, I know that right now, the best thing I could probably do is to survive it, right? So now if you got a system where people have been conditioned to just survive the punishment of it, and then you got other systems where people are instructed that their way is the only way and they are the center of the world in terms of their analysis, then you have a disparate relationship between those two systems. One grouping of people are taught how to rule, another grouping of people are taught how to obey. And folks in public health started looking at this, like Kamara Jones, like Chandra Ford, who were saying, well, this is also, if we understand white supremacy / racism as a public health concern, will CRT allow us to have a analysis of what it is that we're seeing in terms of who has access to what? And more importantly, how do we understand things like disinvestment, where resources have been taken from communities, right? Removed from communities. How do we understand isolation, right? Where communities don't have access to certain things. How do we understand marginalization, right? How do we understand that spatially? How do we understand that economically? How do we understand that in terms of access to healthcare, or explicit examples around access to healthy food sources? And some of the things that you all have been doing in public health and folks on the community side have been saying for quite some time. So for those people who have been marginalized, white supremacy moves to isolate and to eliminate. So now, if we know those things to be true, what is the resistance, right? Because CRT isn't just commentary on the things that are happening, but there's a subset of critical race theory that talks about a praxis, right? It's an action and reflection in the world in order to change conditions. So for my own self, it's not having a PhD and being trained as a researcher, that's cute, but that's not enough, right? So now how do I work in community with folks to actually work to change conditions, because at any given time, those conditions that I'm working to change could be my own, right? So this is really, so if we're talking about public health concerns like housing insecurity, like lack of access to quality healthcare, like gun violence, like not having ways in which to have access to life-affirming institutions. So now we have to think about what is it that we're in, and more importantly, how do we rationalize the particular treatment of people, right? So now, if we pair something like gun violence, which has been identified as a public health concern, and white supremacy, how do we look at a city like Chicago and ask a very different set of questions that are going to bring some discomfort, but also have us recognize how we look at things to provide us with capacities and strategies to do something different. Now, let's go all the way in, y'all, and let's get into our broader discussion as a mayoral forum tonight. And what's going to be hot on the ticket is crime, right? So people are going to be talking about gun violence. People are going to be talking about antagonisms within community space. But there's a very interesting thing, and there's a contradiction there, and there's a relationship to public health that I think we need to explore. In public health, people are always talking about what is the communal health of a particular community? How are people experiencing wellness in their particular space? And in that wellness, what do we need to consider that brings about conflict? Now, I am not talking about the pathology of people, right? So there are no people born with an inherent propensity to crime. That does not exist. But what we do have to take into account that there are situations that can actually exacerbate conflict. And this is a tougher thing for a lot of folks to deal with. But let's just think about it practically. If everybody on the call today were at, so if we took the Zoom call and split everybody in half, one person is at, one grouping of people at one high school, another grouping of people at the other high school. We close one high school, sent everybody to who was in the closed high school to the new school. And I always ask my students, what happens on the first day, right? And, you know, a lot of my students are just like fights, right? In fact, hella fights, right? But now we have to think about this. To what extent does that conflict get engineered? Because if we think about a city like Chicago that is hyper segregated, what we often equate to quote unquote gang beefs is really regional segregation. And now, because people may not know other folks, when new people come in and there hasn't been any way for folks to be in community with each other, tensions can heighten. Now, if we think about that in that way, there's some other things that we have to contend with. And in the mayoral forum, because the popular understanding is that police deter and stop crime. Now, I'm in a criminology law and justice department, and here's what we know. 80 years of criminological data tell us exactly the opposite. Police departments aren't even structured in that way, right? Police departments aren't structured around prevention. They're structured around being a response unit, right? So it's not this thing about a deterrent, right? So now police come after the thing happens. So now in public health, what you all have been doing, which is really important, what are preventative measures, right? When people talk about medicine, I see Dr. Murray on the call. How do folks understand preventative measures? Because here's what we know, and here's what the criminological data tells us. The 4 things that deter and decrease crime are access to healthcare, access to affordable, sustainable housing, access to long-term living wage employment, and lastly, access to quality education. Those are your crime deterrents, but those don't get into our broader conversation. And the question that we have to ask is, what permits us from having that conversation? And one of the things that permits us from having the conversation is not just the 24-hour news cycle, but the inability to think about the reduction of crime as a long-term strategy. People want the upfront presence of police, thinking that that will deter the situation. In fact, in some instances, what we've seen is that it's inflamed the situation. So now, when we start to think about this in real ways, now a crime reduction strategy doesn't necessarily include the folks who are charged with prosecuting or determining an assailant or a broader or someone else who is connected to the crime. It's not the pursuit of those people, right? And I've been paying attention to the recent shootings in California. If we think about Half Moon Bay, Monterey Park, and what we often see in those spaces are people who have been engaged in violent behavior before the actual event of the shooting. So now we have to think about what are the things that could allow for engagement in a different way, right? So now if we think about Half Moon Bay and we think about domestic violence, we think about low-wage service sector work that is often extracted and exploited. And what does that do over time to our state of being, and how does it influence our actions? And those analyses we don't have in the United States. We just think about the bad act, the fatality, and now the punitive sets of relationships for that quote unquote bad act. We don't ever put the actual infraction in context. And critical race theory says we have to think about context if we're talking about any types of solutions, because the context allows us the capacity to understand what is actually happening, who's affected, and what historically has happened in particular communities. And now, when we talk about things like police forces, we can't have a conversation absent of citizen patrols and slave patrols. We can't do that, right? But yet we get in the United States this idea of myth and who is good and who is bad. And those who oppose what is put in front of us as good are now instantaneously bad. And I think this becomes important in terms of how we understand our work moving forward. And critical race theory says, if we're looking at education, if we're looking at space, spatial relationships, if we're looking at public health, we cannot do our work absent of an intersectional analysis of all the things in play. So what you all have been doing in public health, you all have been looking at things and been pushing communities to understand that these, I should say pushing researchers to understand, because communities already know this, but you're pushing researchers to understand that we need to have a holistic account of what it is that we're in. So everything that we do is not linear, it's layered, right? So we're not talking about unilateral relationships. We're talking about layered relationships that have particular histories, that have particular racial components, that have particular gender components, that have particular class components, that have particular disability components. So now we have to think critical race theory is saying, what is racism in conversation with, right? So it's never by itself. So now, what is it in conversation with? And if we understand that conversation, it gets us clearer in terms of the work to be done. Because again, it's not just to have this analysis and say that the analysis is enough. That is not it. It is about understanding that if we have these layered understandings, that those solutions must also address those layers. We can't leave anyone hanging. We can't leave anyone loose in this space, right? And again, I am clear that some of you all on the call today may vehemently disagree with what I'm saying, and that's perfectly fine. But I want us to be clear around critical race theory, because when we see this stuff show up, there are all these convoluted arguments, and very few people have actually read critical race theory. And it's important when we are making these particular broad-based statements that we know what we're talking about, right? Because these are matters of life and death. And because these are matters of life and death and we take it seriously, it's important that we not get caught up in the misinformation, but to actually engage and do our work and to ask questions of this type of moment that we're in. And I, as a critical race theorist, I will say fully that, everybody is kind of freaked out about the Trump moment, about a potential Trump resurgence, and, what has this country become? And I'm always saying to folks, look, if you actually do the history, we see that America has been what it has always been. We just have to recognize the particular iterations, right? And we have to recognize those iterations, and we have to recognize how important it is for people in the United States to mask their relationship to enslavement, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation. And now when we can ask that question, those are no longer just historical questions, but they are also contemporary questions. When we talk about things like gentrification, when we talk about things like displacement, when we talk about things like school closings and who's affected, when we talk about urban sprawl, when we talk about things like prisons and senior citizens' homes being infected with Legionnaire's disease, right? Who is considered disposable? And now in their disposability, how do we rationalize what happens to them? And critical race theory says we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision if we are going to actively interrupt those things we know to bring harm to folks, or we will capitulate to them, right? And now what I really appreciate with organizations like Radical Public Health, with what you all are doing in Epidemics of Injustice class, is really putting this out there to say that everyone is either going to be in the resistance or in the role of the oppressor, right? And we have to figure out, how do we now begin to understand what those roles are? And also, how do we begin to consider the ways in which the society demonstrates its yearning for myth, right? And I think about that from the school space. Young folks will only accept being lied to for so long, right? And after that, they're going to start to reject it. So a full-on holistic approach would be, young folks, we have to trust young folks to engage in accurate inaccuracy. We have to trust young folks to engage in that truth, because what we actually fear as adults is those young folks seeing their own disposability and starting to resist it. And now that resistance is what we fear. And critical race theory says you should never fear that. You should always welcome it, because that's the thing that gets you closer to changing that thing that brings you harm, degradation, and other forms of isolation and marginalization. So we have to be clear about this particular set of relationships, and our conversation becomes different. And I just use the mayoral forum tonight because I don't think that's going to make the ticket in terms of talking about crime reduction, in terms of providing healthcare, housing, employment, and quality education, which we know to be the things that actually prevent them. So now critical race theory is saying, how do we lift the veil on these things that we know to be true, but we fear the answer because the answer goes against the grain of what is accepted, right? And I think this really becomes important as you move forward. So as people start to look at critical race theory, its relationship to things like public health, to education, to housing, to to the criminal legal system, it really becomes important that we ground ourselves in really being critical, not just for the sake of being critical, but we are in a space that shows us that what they are really fearing, what white supremacy fears the most, is the oppressed asking questions of their condition and then working with others to change it. Right? And I think when we actually can grapple with that a little more, that gets us closer to the answers that we see to the issues that are in our respective communities. So I know you all got a pretty packed evening, but let me stop there and just open it up for questions. I know you all got some questions, but I just want to acknowledge you all's time and just keep it open for those questions. And thank you all again for having me.
Thank you again, Dr. Stovall. That was amazing. So we do have some questions in that were from the discussion board, but also from the chat. So I will read from that now. So it says, one of the questions is, and I will also put them in, the ones from the discussion board will also be put in the chat as well. And it says, how can public health professionals utilize CRT methodologies to promote transdisciplinary collaboration, for example, education, healthcare, public health, et cetera, in addressing the root causes of structural racism, particularly in places where the existence of racism is denied and CRT is actively discouraged, such as under the DeSantis administration in Florida?
Definitely. And I think this is a really important moment, because now this is the time for folks to really enact some bravery, right? And this is like the fear of first persecution won't work in this space. But what is on the side of folks is a historical record, right? That's the thing that's hardest to erase. So I think when folks actually go to the historical record, despite it being contested, and this is the suit that's happening in Florida now around the AP Black Studies curriculum, where folks are saying, are we willing to say that we do not want young people to be taught historical accuracy, right? And that's a tougher argument for the state of Florida to actually engage, because what actually is happening in places like Florida, they know some of this stuff won't stand up in court, but they don't care. Their thing is to understand, if we can put the fear in folks, them fighting us after it already wins the battle for us, right? We just want this thing to actually stoke the fear first, right? We may not win it long term, but we want it to stoke the fear, right? It's a populist tool. So now what we have to do is really rely on the historical accuracy. So no conjecture, no making things up. These are things, these are the historical records. These are the particular things that we need to pay attention to. A second thing, in places that are hostile like that, I think it's really important to understand the capacity and necessity of mutual aid. You all in public health do a good job with that in terms of recognizing community strategies around mutual aid. And mutual aid meaning the distribution of resources in spaces where people who may not have a lot of resources are shared in communities. And now, even as I say this, right, the fear mongering says, well, is Stovall on the call now supporting socialism? And it's like, well, look, if we talk about distribution of resources to folks who have been historically denied, call it what you want. The need is the need. So now, how do we now start to think about going into those spaces again with historical accuracy, but also being very clear about need? And I think mutual aid, when public health researchers observed how community members participated in mutual aid, in Chicago being kind of a hotbed for this in a heat wave of 95, now those public health researchers looked at what Latinx communities were doing and understood the power of mutual aid. And I think now we're also in that moment to now begin to think about what communities are showing us, and now how can we support those particular communities.
Oh, thank you so much. So I will make a note again. We would prefer if you please put your questions in the chat, but I do know someone raised their hand. So Asha, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, sorry. I didn't know we had to write it in the chat. But hello. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. That was very incredible and insightful. And I wanted to ask, in regards to critical race theory, like I wonder how people can talk to other people about it in a way in which they don't immediately shut off or like shut down. And also a question like, how are there any ties between critical race theory and the pursuits of abolition in a sense?
Definitely. And there is, to the first part of your question, in terms of talking to folks about critical race theory without having them shut down, there's this excellent book by a guy named Victor Ray called On Critical Race Theory, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. That, I think, it's a very strong, very clear reading around what CRT is and why we need to pay attention to it in the United States. And then there are a group of folks who are now thinking about abolition and the relationship of critical race theory. I've been working with a group of folks across the country who brought in an understanding of abolition and now pairing it with CRT, because if we're talking about a praxis, abolition says it's not just about tearing things down, but it's also about building what you need. So abolition, like critical race praxis, is calling for a need to build. So if there are things, abolition says that there are things that are unacceptable. If we know these things to be unacceptable, now what are we willing to do to build something else? And that's a parallel argument for folks who do critical race praxis and for folks who are in abolitionist communities. And I think that's a natural pairing in terms of now, how are we thinking about building the things that we need, because the things that we suffer under are unacceptable and need to be destroyed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. So we had another question. It said, also thinking about disposability in terms of COVID, who are we okay with letting get sick and die? How are we rationalizing the human toll in the US and around the world? Oh, sorry. And then I'm not sure if that's a separate question or that's fine. Thank you. So yeah, so that's the question and it'll be put in the chat.
Well, again, all right, the COVID moment just intensified what we already knew, right? So we knew that we were in a space that was grounded in slavery, genocide, wrongful land appropriation. We knew that many communities were marginalized. They were marginalized in particular ways. And now with the advent of COVID and people not having access to particular resources, and then even a confluence of those resources that now would get to spaces that have a logical, and I think it's important for you all in public health to hear this, that have a logical distrust of the medical community because of its relationship historically to it. So now we have to think about what that relationship building is, because we now, and people may think about it to be irrational, but if we look at it historically, many Black and Brown communities have been excoriated by medical researchers and the like, and have been experimented on. We have this history. So I think it's really important to think about those levels of disposability. So now one group has been groups have been excluded, COVID hits, that exclusion becomes deeper, and now the prices paid is a fatality. So now we think about these deleterious health effects that now become instantaneous. So now you couple that with relationships that haven't necessarily been built in community spaces to actually provide the well-being and care that folks need. So again, the disposability becomes compounded. So now we have to think about the ways in which that looks, and now what are people doing to actually provide and really a community-based popular education around healthcare in a particular way. And I've seen some examples of people who've done this with quite a bit of fidelity and responsibility. But again, we have to wrestle with the COVID moment just exacerbated what we've already known and just made it deeper in terms of our understanding of it in real time.
Thank you so much. I on a professional note, I've also done some work around COVID and disability and food and resource access and what people have done. And overwhelmingly, the disability community turned to itself to share resources and to kind of take actions that were, that kind of helped to not repair, but to do what they could for a really flawed system. And so our next question is, so I did want to jump back. I did realize that there was someone had asked another question about Florida. And so they were actually explicitly saying, so, is the rejection of the AP kind of American history course, it makes them question, what about AP European history, AP Japanese, German, Italian language, or other cultural courses? Are there other states in the US that have acted in a similar way? And if so, why is Florida gaining so much attention? And so I guess, the heart of the question is, obviously it's this particular, for Florida, it's this particular AP in this particular area, but are there, and I think we should look historically, have there been other states that have done similar things with the advanced placement courses? And if so, why are we focused on just Florida?
Right. So Florida is the first who's actually contested the advanced placement course. Now, what we have seen in places like Idaho, Iowa, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, I'm just naming states that have some type of anti-CRT legislation on the docket and actually have put it into law. What they've made an argument around is divisive material, right? So this idea around what is divisive, right? What is promoting, and like Executive Order 1058 under the Trump administration, right? So anything that's promoting that one grouping of people is better than the other, or that there's that white supremacy is a naturalized phenomenon, all of these things that have been identified, which doesn't ever happen in these particular trainings. It's just people going off of their ego and sensitivity around the issue. But this idea, and the reason why the Florida piece won't stand in court, because there's no teaching of conjecture, right? So it's not, there's not an argument around opinion, right? It's literally the literature and historical instances of African descended people in the United States. So that's going to be hard for the state of Florida to prove that material is divisive. But when we have other states that say not only is the material divisive, but the way the teacher is teaching it is divisive, and that's where the subjectivity comes in, and that's where the courts have a decision that they make not based on fact, but based on their observation of what the district has told them or what have you. So this is the day that we're in. But the Florida piece, the state of Florida is the first one that has actually responded to an AP, outlawing an AP curriculum.
Thank you for the clarification. And so another question was, on a nation such as ours that has been built on capitalism and holds it as a core value, how do you suggest we fix this? And also, based on your experience and knowledge, what would be a better alternative to capitalism, as we know both extremes are bad takes, countries like Cuba, for example. So how do we find that balance?
Right. I don't necessarily think about it as a balance, but it's kind of like harmony, right? So balance is saying all things equal, right? But harmony says that you have to have a system that you can adjust to your needs, right? So I think as alternatives, it's about mutual aid and what people refer to as solidarity economies, right? So a solidarity economy says that those who are the most marginalized should now be in the center of our analysis in terms of how do resources actually get to those folks. And another thing in solidarity economies is now thinking about what is the greater good of people? And now how do we get those resources to folks as alternatives to capitalism? Because there are a couple of terms in capitalism that we don't wrestle with in the United States, and other countries are pretty clear around this. So in the United States, when we talk about capitalism, we also use a term called growth, right? So now, what constitutes growth? And the more important question is, who gets exploited in order for growth to happen, right? So it's this very individualized advantage system. So now, when you think about, well, what are systems that do not rest on the sole engagement of the individual, and say, well, now, if we have a broader distribution of the resources, can we get things to folks who have historically been marginalized? And ironically, you have countries that do this, but they're viewed as antithetical to life in the United States because they have a higher tax rate than folks in the United States do. But if we look at tax rates in the United States, we look at a grouping of people that don't make a lot of money are taxed more than the wealthy, which is an absurd system, right? So now when we think about this and looking at places like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, who have a different tax system, but also have thought about distribution of resources in a completely different way. Now, there's still some issues with Scandinavia and how they view economies in Scandinavia and their lack of analysis of race. So, but at the same time, at minimum, they have a very clear analysis of leaving no one destitute and now having resources for those folks.
I did fun, interesting thing. Many of the people in Scandinavia aren't actually the indigenous people, the Sami people are, and they've been pushed to the far reaches of Scandinavia. Also, they had a secret eugenics project against disabled people. So if you're wondering why certain countries don't have a lot of disabled people, they also have a lot of screenings, like pregnancy screenings are required. So that's another thing for another time. But we do have one more question I'd like to ask. And it's so someone had read, the Ford article, which was one of the articles that was put in the Google Classroom and on Blackboard, and said, I would be curious to hear if there have been any other attempts to study the effects of these chronic racism exposures on health.
Yes, so you got quite a, now since Kamara Jones in the early 2000s, who is a physician and a researcher, when she talked about a medical definition of racism, you now have a grouping of people who have started to move on this and kind of the stuff that you all are doing in class around looking at the structural determinants of health. So now when you talk about white supremacy and its affect on the structural determinants of health, you're seeing things come out like more studies around childhood trauma, or what people are referring to as adverse childhood experiences. You're also seeing studies around complex and compound trauma or longitudinal trauma. So these are also spaces that not only are interrogating what some people may think to be the mental health of folks, but they're actually connecting it to the physical health of folks. And I think that's a really important piece, because preventative medicine always connects to things. The responsive or reactive medicine wants to separate it, but it runs antithetical to what we know about the body and the mind, that they're deeply and intimately connected. So now in the last 25 years, you're seeing more folks start to talk about the affect of white supremacy on health outcomes. So that really becomes, we're in an important moment in terms of people starting to engage that explicitly.
Thank you so much. And not to put you on the spot, but I did want to know because there are some questions that have been coming in that we don't have time for, obviously, if you'd be open to members or students emailing you for follow-up questions or things like that.
Yeah, no problem. Not a problem at all.
All right. Thank you so much. So those who did not get your questions answered, I'm sorry, but you can, we will make that information available to you. And I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Stovall. This was amazing. And I think it has generated a lot of really great discussion in the chat. And so we will have, yes, thank you. Oh, I love all the reactions. Yeah, so we're actually going to have a 5-minute break. So set your timers. And for students in the class, we will move on to the second link in Blackboard. And please make sure you go to that link as well. It is also part of the class where we will have a short discussion, but we will also talk about how to implement critical race theory in stories, in interviews through the StoryCorps style. If any of you are familiar with StoryCorps and the types of stories they've told about race, that is just what we will be doing with our students. So thank you very much and have a great night. We will see all of our community members next